Every plan has an assumption buried underneath it, and every avoidant who ever tried to teach someone a lesson through distance, silence, or a calculated discard built that plan on exactly one assumption, the same assumption that has worked reliably for them their entire relational history. The assumption is simple: withdraw, and the other person will scramble to close the gap. Create discomfort, and the other person will absorb it, adjust, apologize, soften whatever behavior apparently warranted the punishment in the first place. This assumption has functioned as bedrock for almost every one of an avoidant's previous relationships, which is exactly why they reach for it so confidently, so automatically, whenever they decide, consciously or semi-consciously, that someone needs to be taught something. What happens when that assumption turns out to be wrong is what this entire exploration is about. Not wrong occasionally, not wrong in some minor, easily corrected way, but fundamentally structurally wrong because the person on the receiving end of the lesson simply doesn't perform the role the plan required. And when that happens, something considerably more significant than an ordinary miscalculation occurs. The avoidant doesn't just fail to teach the intended lesson. They end up learning one instead, usually far more painful, far more revealing, and far more permanent than anything they originally set out to teach. Anyone listening who has been on the receiving end of an avoidant's deliberate, calculated withdrawal, the kind that felt less like ordinary distance and more like a punishment with a specific lesson attached to it, deserves to understand exactly what that strategy was built on, why it was destined to fail the moment it encountered someone who refused to play the expected role, and what actually happens inside an avoidant once their carefully constructed plan collapses entirely. It's worth naming, before going further, how this particular pattern tends to be distinguished from ordinary conflict within a relationship, because the distinction matters for recognizing it accurately rather than mistaking every instance of withdrawal following disagreement for this more deliberate, calculated version. Ordinary conflict, followed by a period of natural distance while both people process what happened, is a normal, healthy part of any relationship, and it doesn't carry the same intentional, corrective quality being described throughout this exploration. What distinguishes the pattern being examined here is the specific combination of timing, duration, and apparent purpose. Withdrawal that seems calibrated less toward genuine processing and more toward producing a specific behavioral change in the other person, often disproportionate in length or intensity relative to whatever triggered it in the first place. It helps to start by naming, honestly and specifically, what this kind of deliberate lesson teaching actually looks like, because it's often subtle enough to be mistaken for ordinary avoidant withdrawal, rather than recognized as the more calculated maneuver it actually is. Ordinary avoidant withdrawal tends to be reactive, an automatic, largely unconscious response to feeling overwhelmed or exposed. The kind of withdrawal being described throughout this exploration carries a different quality, more deliberate, more strategic, often triggered by a specific perceived offense, a boundary that was held too firmly, a request that felt too demanding, some moment where the avoidant felt their usual sense of control being challenged in a way they weren't prepared to simply accept. In response to this perceived challenge, an avoidant employing this particular strategy doesn't simply withdraw to protect themselves. They withdraw with intent, using distance and silence as tools specifically designed to produce a corrective effect in the other person. Discomfort severe enough to teach a lesson about what happens when the avoidant's autonomy gets challenged, when their preferred pace gets questioned, when they're asked to offer more consistency or communication than they're currently prepared to provide. This is, at its core, an attempt to restore a particular kind of relational hierarchy, one where the avoidant retains ultimate control over the terms of closeness, and where any challenge to that control gets met with a consequence severe enough to discourage future challenges. This deserves to be named plainly because it represents something distinct from the more sympathetic, purely defensive, avoidant behavior explored in other contexts. This specific pattern carries an element of calculation, sometimes fully conscious, sometimes operating just below full awareness, but nonetheless oriented toward producing a specific outcome in someone else, rather than simply managing an avoidant's own internal discomfort. It's worth being honest about this distinction because it matters for understanding both why this pattern deserves a firmer, less accommodating response than ordinary avoidant withdrawal might, and why its eventual failure carries such significant consequences once it doesn't work the way it was designed to. It helps to name some of the specific tactics that tend to compose this broader strategy, because recognizing them individually makes the overall pattern considerably easier to identify while it's actually happening, rather than only in hindsight once it has already run its full course. One common tactic involves selective, pointed withdrawal of warmth specifically in the areas most likely to be noticed and felt, a sudden coolness in tone, a withholding of the small, previously reliable gestures of affection or attention that had come to feel like an ordinary part of the relationship's rhythm. This selective withdrawal tends to be calibrated specifically around whatever the other person seems to value most, precisely because maximizing discomfort in that specific area produces the strongest possible motivation to scramble toward correction. Another common tactic involves a kind of performed indifference, an exaggerated display of being entirely unaffected by whatever conflict or boundary triggered the withdrawal in the first place, often accompanied by an uptick in visible engagement elsewhere, increased socializing, conspicuous displays of enjoying life independently, designed to communicate, without ever saying so directly, that the avoidant doesn't actually need the relationship or the specific behavior being contested nearly as much as the other person might assume. This performed indifference functions as a kind of psychological pressure, an implicit threat that continued insistence on the contested boundary or request might simply result in the avoidant genuinely, permanently disengaging. A further tactic, somewhat more subtle than the other two, involves selective memory and reframing, revisiting the specific conflict or request that triggered the withdrawal and recharacterizing it, sometimes explicitly, sometimes simply through tone and implication, as unreasonable, excessive, or evidence of some deeper flaw in the other person's character or judgment. This tactic serves a dual function, both discouraging the specific behavior being targeted and subtly undermining the other person's confidence in their own judgment, making them more likely to doubt themselves and scramble toward accommodation rather than trusting their own original assessment of what was reasonable to ask for in the first place. Recognizing these specific tactics matters considerably because they help distinguish this calculated pattern from ordinary avoidant withdrawal considerably more clearly than a purely abstract description ever could. Ordinary avoidant withdrawal tends to lack this particular combination of selective targeting, performed indifference, and reframing, because ordinary withdrawal is primarily reactive and self-protective, rather than oriented around producing a specific corrective effect in someone else. The presence of this more deliberate combination signals something worth taking seriously and responding to firmly, rather than something that necessarily deserves the same patient, understanding accommodation that purely defensive, unintentional avoidant behavior might reasonably receive. The plan itself tends to follow a fairly predictable internal logic, even when the avoidant employing it has never consciously articulated it this clearly, even to themselves. The logic goes something like this: withdraw noticeably enough to create real discomfort. Maintain that withdrawal long enough for anxiety to build on the other side. Wait for the anticipated response, increased effort, increased accommodation, an apology or a softening of whatever boundary or request originally triggered the withdrawal. Once that anticipated response arrives, gradually re-engage, having successfully re-established the preferred balance of control, having taught, without ever having to say so directly, that certain behaviours carry consequences severe enough to discourage repetition. This entire strategy depends on one critical, often unexamined assumption that the other person's investment in the relationship, combined with whatever anxious attachment patterns or conflict avoidant tendencies they might carry, will reliably produce the anticipated scrambling response. For much of an avoidance relational history, this assumption holds up reasonably well, precisely because many people, especially people whose own relational patterns lean toward anxiety or accommodation, do respond to this kind of calculated distance exactly the way the strategy predicts, closing the gap eagerly, adjusting their own behavior, sometimes apologizing for things that never actually warranted an apology in the first place, simply to restore the relationship's equilibrium as quickly as possible. It's worth tracing this strategy back to its likely origin, because understanding where it comes from clarifies why it feels so automatic and so confidently deployed, despite ultimately proving unreliable against certain people. This particular pattern, using withdrawal and engineered discomfort to reassert control after a perceived challenge, often has roots considerably earlier than any specific adult relationship, sometimes tracing back to early experiences where affection or attention was withdrawn conditionally, contingent on compliance or good behavior, teaching, long before adulthood, that love and approval could be used strategically to shape another person's behavior. Having experienced this dynamic from the receiving end at some earlier point in life, it isn't unusual for someone to eventually replicate the same mechanism from the position of power, deploying it now rather than simply enduring it. This origin doesn't excuse the pattern once it appears in an adult relationship, but it does offer useful context for understanding why it feels so instinctive and so confidently executed, almost like a well-rehearsed script rather than something requiring conscious, deliberate planning each time it gets deployed. It also explains why this particular strategy tends to feel deeply unsettling when it fails, since its failure doesn't just disrupt a single relationship's dynamic, it implicitly challenges a mechanism that may have felt, on some unconscious level, like a reliable, even necessary tool for maintaining safety and control across an entire lifetime of relationships, extending well beyond whatever specific relationship happens to be the current context in which it's being deployed. There's something worth addressing here as well regarding why this particular strategy tends to work reliably on some people while failing so completely against others, because understanding this variation clarifies why this dynamic unfolds so differently depending on who happens to be on the receiving end of it. People whose own early experiences taught them that love requires vigilant effort, that affection must be earned and re-earned continuously through accommodation and appeasement, tend to be considerably more susceptible to this particular tactic because the engineered discomfort of calculated withdrawal activates a deeply familiar, deeply ingrained response, the urgent need to restore approval through immediate, visible effort. People whose own early experiences instead built a more settled, secure sense of their own worth, one that doesn't depend on constant external validation or approval in order to feel stable, tend to respond to this same tactic quite differently, not because they care less about the relationship or the person deploying the tactic, but because their sense of worth simply doesn't require the kind of anxious scrambling the tactic is specifically designed to provoke. This distinction matters enormously because it explains why the exact same calculated withdrawal can produce dramatically different outcomes depending entirely on the internal architecture of whoever happens to be on the receiving end of it. a variable the avoidant deploying the tactic rarely, if ever, consciously accounts for in advance. This is precisely where the humbling begins, because this assumption, reliable as it may have been across a long history of prior relationships, doesn't hold universally, and when it encounters someone whose own psychology doesn't operate according to the predicted script, the entire strategy collapses in a way the avoidant never actually planned for or prepared to handle. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone who has spent years playing a particular game, one where a specific move reliably produces a specific, predictable response from every opponent they've ever faced, so reliably that the move has become almost automatic, requiring no real thought or adjustment before deploying it. Then imagine this same person facing an opponent who simply doesn't respond to that move at all, who remains entirely unmoved by the exact tactic that has worked flawlessly every previous time it was employed. The confusion in this moment isn't simply about losing a single round. It's about confronting the sudden, disorienting possibility that the entire strategy, something relied upon so completely and for so long, was never actually as universally effective as its consistent prior success had suggested. This is close to what happens inside an avoidant when their calculated withdrawal, deployed with full confidence based on a long history of it working reliably, simply fails to produce the anticipated response in someone whose own psychology doesn't operate according to the predicted script. It's worth being specific about what this kind of unexpected non-response actually looks like from the outside, because it tends to be considerably less dramatic than people might expect. And its power lies precisely in that lack of drama. Rather than scrambling to close the gap, the person on the receiving end of this calculated withdrawal simply continues living their life, engaged, present, unbothered in any visible, escalating way. Rather than offering increased accommodation or apology, they maintain whatever boundary or request originally triggered the withdrawal, neither retreating from it defensively nor escalating it aggressively, simply holding it steadily, as though it were a reasonable, unremarkable position, rather than something requiring negotiation or correction. This response, or more accurately this absence of the anticipated response, tends to be genuinely disorienting for an avoidant employing this particular strategy, precisely because it removes every piece of feedback the plan was designed to generate and respond to. There's no anxious scrambling to interpret as confirmation that the lesson is working. There's no apology to accept as evidence that the boundary has been successfully renegotiated. There's simply continued steadiness on the other side, functioning almost like a mirror reflecting the avoidant's own tactic back at them, without producing any of the intended effect. This is where something genuinely significant begins to unfold inside the avoidant, a process considerably more destabilizing than simply realizing a single strategy didn't work this particular time. Because the strategy has functioned reliably across so much of their prior relational history, its failure here tends to trigger something closer to a deeper, more unsettling reconsideration, not simply of this specific relationship, but of the underlying assumption the strategy was always built on. The assumption that control over closeness and distance could always be reliably reasserted through calculated withdrawal whenever it felt threatened or challenged. This reconsideration doesn't happen quickly or comfortably. It tends to unfold gradually, often accompanied by a kind of mounting confusion that the avoidant themselves struggles to name clearly, since naming it directly would require acknowledging something considerably more uncomfortable than simply having misjudged one particular situation. It requires acknowledging that an entire relational strategy, one central to how they've navigated closeness and vulnerability across their whole adult life, might not actually function the way they've always assumed it did, might depend far more heavily than they ever realized on the specific psychology of whoever happens to be on the receiving end of it. There's something worth validating clearly here for anyone listening who has held their ground steadily through exactly this kind of calculated withdrawal, refusing to scramble, refusing to apologize for boundaries or requests that never warranted apology in the first place, simply continuing forward with their own life, regardless of the discomfort effort the avoidant silence was specifically designed to produce. This steadiness, however difficult it was to maintain in the moment, represents something genuinely significant, not simply personal resilience, though it certainly reflects that as well, but a direct disruption of a strategy that likely worked reliably on this avoidant, and possibly on many people before them, for a very long time. Holding steady in the face of calculated withdrawal isn't a small thing. It's precisely the variable the entire strategy failed to account for, and its presence changes everything about how this particular dynamic ultimately unfolds. As this reconsideration deepens, the avoidant employing this strategy tends to move through a fairly recognizable sequence, distinct from the earlier stages of ordinary avoidant panic explored in other contexts, precisely because this sequence begins from a place of intended control rather than simply reactive fear. The earliest phase tends to involve a kind of stubborn escalation, an unwillingness to abandon the strategy simply because it hasn't yet produced the anticipated result, extending the withdrawal further, waiting longer, essentially doubling down on a plan that isn't working rather than reconsidering its underlying premise. This escalation reflects something important about how deeply this particular strategy has been relied upon. A resistance to the possibility that it might simply be failing, because acknowledging that failure requires confronting a considerably larger, more uncomfortable question about how much genuine control the avoidant actually holds over other people's responses to their behavior. This escalation phase tends to eventually exhaust itself, not because the avoidant consciously decides to abandon the strategy, but because the accumulating absence of any anticipated response gradually becomes impossible to explain away or wait out any longer. This is typically where something closer to genuine confusion sets in, a mounting, uncomfortable awareness that the plan simply isn't working, paired with an equally uncomfortable uncertainty about what to actually do next, since the entire strategy never accounted for this particular outcome and therefore never included any contingency for what should happen once it became clear the lesson wasn't landing. It helps to describe this internal confusion in more specific detail because it tends to produce a particular kind of psychological discomfort, distinct from ordinary heartbreak or ordinary avoidant panic already explored in other contexts. This confusion often carries a quality of genuine bewilderment, a repeated, almost compulsive mental replay of the situation, searching for the miscalculation, the moment where the strategy should have started working but didn't, the specific point where the anticipated scrambling should have begun but never materialized. This replay rarely produces a satisfying answer because the actual explanation that the strategy itself was flawed in its underlying assumption rather than simply mistimed or under-executed is precisely the explanation the avoidant's usual defenses are least equipped to consider or accept. This period often produces a noticeable decline in the avoidant's usual composure across other areas of life as well. Difficulty concentrating, increased irritability, a persistent low-grade preoccupation that bleeds into contexts that have nothing directly to do with the relationship itself. This spillover reflects how significant this particular failure actually is beneath the surface, considerably more destabilizing than a single failed tactic within a single relationship, because it touches something closer to the avoidant's entire operating theory about how control and closeness function in their life more broadly. There's a particular kind of shame that often accompanies this confusion as well, though it rarely gets acknowledged directly, even internally. This shame relates specifically to the exposure involved in having a calculated strategy fail so visibly, having deployed something intended to demonstrate control, and instead having that same deployment reveal, unmistakably, a lack of it. This shame differs meaningfully from the more straightforward grief or panic explored in other contexts, because it carries a specific self-referential quality, discomfort not just about losing something valued, but about having been, in some sense, caught attempting something manipulative and having that attempt fail in full view. It's worth naming what tends to happen next, because it often produces behaviour that looks genuinely different from anything witnessed earlier in the relationship, precisely because the avoidant is now operating without the script they've relied on for so long. This is frequently where the first genuine, if clumsy, attempts at direct communication begin to appear, an uncharacteristic willingness to actually address what happened, rather than simply waiting for the usual dynamic to reassert itself on its own. These attempts often carry a noticeably different quality than the avoidant's usual communication style. Less controlled, less composed, sometimes even visibly uncomfortable in ways that suggest genuine uncertainty rather than calculated strategy. This shift matters considerably because it represents something the original strategy never anticipated needing: genuine, direct engagement, rather than the passive, withdrawal-based tactics the avoidant has relied on throughout most of their relational history. Forced into this position specifically because the withdrawal strategy failed to produce its intended result, some avoidants discover, for the first time, that direct communication, uncomfortable as it is, actually produces information and outcomes that indirect withdrawal-based tactics never could. This discovery, however accidental and however forced by circumstance, rather than chosen deliberately, occasionally becomes a genuine turning point, an unplanned introduction to a different, healthier way of navigating conflict and closeness than anything the avoidant had previously known how to access. It's worth addressing something practical here, because recognizing this pattern accurately naturally raises a question about how to actually respond to it while it's happening, rather than only understanding it clearly after the fact, once the entire sequence has already played out. The most effective response, based on everything explored throughout this piece, doesn't involve confrontation, doesn't involve explicitly naming the manipulation while it's occurring, and doesn't involve any kind of counter-strategy designed specifically to punish or educate the avoidant in return. It simply involves continuing to hold whatever boundary or request originally triggered the withdrawal, calmly and consistently, while continuing to engage fully with one's own life, regardless of the discomfort the withdrawal was designed to produce. This response works precisely because it denies the strategy the one input it requires in order to function: visible distress and scrambling accommodation. It doesn't require dramatic declarations of independence or pointed comments designed to demonstrate unbotheredness. It simply requires genuine, authentic continuation of one's own life and one's own reasonable positions, without performance and without any particular concern for how that continuation lands on the other side of it. This is often easier described than actually practiced, particularly in a relationship that still carries genuine affection and investment, but its simplicity is precisely what makes it so effective against a strategy built entirely around producing a very different, much more anxious response. It's worth naming too why explicit confrontation during this period tends to be considerably less effective than simple, quiet steadiness, even though confrontation might feel more satisfying or more direct in the moment. Naming the manipulation explicitly while the avoidant is still actively deploying it tends to trigger defensiveness rather than reflection, giving the avoidant an external target, the accusation itself, to focus on and reject, rather than leaving them alone with the more uncomfortable, more productive confusion that quiet, unexplained steadiness tends to produce instead. This isn't to suggest that direct communication has no place in addressing this pattern eventually.